Throughout modern investigative history, authorities have documented cases in which individuals vanished without leaving physical evidence, confirmed sightings, or reliable traces, forcing investigators to confront situations where disappearance occurs. Despite established surveillance systems and standardized investigative procedures designed to prevent such outcomes, these disappearances are categorized separately from typical missing person cases because they lack indicators of violence, preparation, or intent, removing the foundational clues normally used to determine whether a disappearance was voluntary, accidental, or criminal in nature. In many verified cases, the individuals were last observed performing routine activities such as commuting, shopping, or attending appointments, behavior that suggests continuity rather than disruption, making the sudden absence particularly difficult to contextualize. Investigators rely heavily on behavioral analysis during early stages. Yet in these cases, background checks, interviews, and personal histories often reveal no psychological distress, conflict, or instability that might explain an intentional disappearance. Surveillance technology is assumed to provide coverage in public and semi-public environments, but numerous disappearances occur in areas monitored by cameras, access controls, and digital tracking systems that nevertheless fail to produce a complete visual or chronological record. Reviews of surveillance footage frequently reveal partial documentation, showing individuals entering locations without corresponding exit footage, highlighting blind spots, system limitations, or human oversight within monitoring infrastructure. These gaps complicate reconstruction efforts, as investigators must infer movement rather than confirm it, increasing reliance on probability instead of verifiable sequence. Digital evidence has become central to modern investigations, yet some disappearance cases involve abrupt termination of phone signals, location data, and financial activity without technical explanation or subsequent reactivation. Analysts must then determine whether such digital silence results from deliberate actions, technical failure, environmental interference, or unknown external events, each possibility carrying different investigative implications. The absence of digital interaction after disappearance eliminates common investigative anchors, such as transaction trails or communication records, significantly reducing the ability to establish post-disappearance movement. Vehicles linked to missing individuals are sometimes later discovered intact and undamaged, containing personal belongings that contradict theories of voluntary departure or planned disappearance. The presence of essential items within abandoned vehicles introduces contradictions that investigators must reconcile, as intentional disappearance typically involves removal of identifying materials and resources. Family accounts often emphasize the individual's future plans, responsibilities, and stability, contributing context that challenges assumptions of self-initiated absence. While investigators remain cautious about relying solely on retrospective testimony, consistent patterns across unrelated cases reinforce the difficulty of explaining these disappearances through conventional psychological models. Collectively, these cases establish a phenomenon defined not by dramatic events, but by absence of evidence, placing investigators in a position where lack of information becomes the central obstacle rather than a starting point. As investigations progress, authorities begin comparing these disappearances across jurisdictions, identifying recurring structural similarities such as sudden loss of contact, absence of physical struggle, and incomplete surveillance coverage, which suggests systemic limitations rather than isolated investigative failure. One recurring challenge involves the assumption that populated environments naturally produce witnesses. Yet many disappearances occur in locations where bystanders later report seeing nothing unusual or fail to recall specific details. Human perception and memory limitations complicate these cases, as routine environments rarely prompt heightened attention, allowing critical moments to pass unnoticed and undocumented. Investigators must therefore evaluate not only what witnesses report, but also what they may have failed to perceive, introducing uncertainty into timeline reconstruction. In several documented cases, Access-controlled spaces, such as office buildings, parking structures, or transit hubs, become focal points due to incomplete or malfunctioning entry and exit records. Audits of these systems often reveal maintenance gaps, synchronization errors, or data retention limitations that undermine assumptions of comprehensive monitoring. These technical shortcomings demonstrate how reliance on automated systems can create false confidence in coverage and traceability. Search operations typically commence quickly, yet early delays or misinterpretation of last known locations can significantly reduce the likelihood of recovering meaningful evidence. Environmental variables such as weather, terrain, and urban infrastructure can further degrade evidence within short time frames, narrowing investigative windows. As time passes, cases shift from active search to analytical review, where investigators reassess initial assumptions and identify potential oversights. However, absence of new information limits the effectiveness of retrospective analysis, often resulting in circular reasoning rather than resolution. Interagency coordination introduces additional complexity, as jurisdictional boundaries and differing protocols can fragment investigative responsibility. Communication gaps between agencies may delay data sharing, hindering comprehensive analysis during critical early stages. These structural challenges contribute to cases remaining unresolved, not due to lack of effort, but due to compounded systemic constraints. By this stage, investigators often recognize that conventional investigative models may be insufficient to explain disappearances characterized primarily by absence rather than evidence. As cases remain unresolved, investigators increasingly rely on pattern analysis, comparing timelines, behaviors, and environmental contexts across multiple disappearances to identify structural similarities that might suggest overlooked mechanisms rather than isolated anomalies. This comparative approach often reveals that many individuals vanished within narrow time windows, sometimes minutes apart from last confirmed contact, emphasizing how quickly disappearance can occur without generating observable disturbance. The brevity of these windows limits investigative intervention, as authorities are often notified only after significant time has passed, reducing opportunities for immediate containment or observation. Technological assumptions play a critical role, as investigators expect mobile devices, cameras, and transaction systems to generate traceable data. Yet real cases demonstrate how these systems can fail simultaneously or independently. Failures may result from environmental interference, infrastructure limitations, or human behavior, none of which necessarily leave clear indicators within available records. The absence of corroborating data forces investigators to consider multiple competing explanations without sufficient evidence to prioritize one conclusively. Over time, cases accumulate unresolved elements, transforming them into cold cases defined more by unanswered questions than by actionable leads. Periodic review of these cases is conducted as new technologies emerge, including advances in data analytics, facial recognition, and forensic reconstruction. While such advances have resolved some historical cases, many disappearances remain resistant, suggesting that missing data cannot always be recovered retroactively. Families often continue to provide information long after official investigations slow, contributing personal records, memories, and hypotheses in hope of renewed attention. The prolonged uncertainty places emotional strain on relatives, who must navigate legal, psychological, and social consequences without closure. Investigators acknowledge that absence of evidence does not equate to absence of event. Yet without confirmation, definitive conclusions remain unattainable. These cases challenge the assumption that modern society can always account for individual movement and presence. They expose the limitations of surveillance, investigation, and documentation when critical moments go unobserved. At this point in the investigation, the phenomenon of people vanishing without a trace stands not as an anomaly, but as a documented reality that continues to resist explanation. As investigations move beyond initial search phases, authorities often revisit early assumptions, recognizing that first interpretations of timelines and locations may have unintentionally narrowed the scope of inquiry and excluded alternative movement paths. Reanalysis frequently reveals that last confirmed sightings were treated as fixed endpoints rather than probabilistic markers, limiting exploration of unverified routes or short deviations that could fundamentally alter understanding of the disappearance. This reliance on last known positions highlights a structural limitation, as investigative models depend heavily on confirmation rather than uncertainty, which may obscure critical transitional moments. In some cases, later discoveries show that key information was overlooked not due to negligence, but because it appeared insignificant when viewed without contextual hindsight. Witness statements revisited years later often gain relevance when compared against broader patterns identified in unrelated cases, demonstrating how isolated details may only gain meaning through comparison. Despite this, memory degradation and inconsistent recall introduce reliability issues, making retrospective witness analysis inherently limited. Investigators also confront institutional constraints, including case prioritization, funding limitations, and staffing changes that disrupt continuity over long periods. These disruptions can lead to fragmented knowledge, where no single investigator retains comprehensive understanding of the case history. Technological evolution introduces both opportunity and challenge, as older data formats, storage limitations, and privacy regulations may restrict access to historical records. Even when data exists, legal and technical barriers can prevent effective re-examination using modern tools. Some disappearances involve cross-jurisdictional complexity, where movement across municipal or national boundaries introduces additional layers of procedural delay. Coordination across jurisdictions depends on timely information sharing, which may not occur uniformly in the early stages of investigation. This fragmentation can prevent formation of a coherent narrative, leaving investigators with disconnected fragments rather than a continuous sequence. Over time, unresolved disappearances accumulate administrative classifications that shift focus from active search to archival status. Once categorized as cold cases, investigative momentum often diminishes despite ongoing interest from families and advocacy groups. Families frequently assume the role of independent investigators, gathering records, organizing information, and maintaining public awareness. While these efforts can generate renewed attention, they may also reflect the gap between institutional capacity and unresolved demand for answers. Psychological analysis of disappearance cases reveals that prolonged uncertainty produces distinct forms of grief, often described as ambiguous loss. This condition complicates emotional resolution, as absence prevents confirmation of death, while hope prevents closure. From an investigative perspective, ambiguous loss also complicates decision-making, as neither survival nor death can be conclusively established. Some cases experience renewed interest following unrelated discoveries, technological breakthroughs, or changes in investigative standards. Yet even with renewed scrutiny, missing foundational evidence limits the effectiveness of re-examination. These limitations underscore the importance of early-stage data preservation and comprehensive documentation. Despite lessons learned, new disappearance cases continue to emerge with similar structural characteristics. This repetition suggests that systemic vulnerabilities remain unresolved within investigative and monitoring frameworks. The phenomenon challenges confidence in assumptions about traceability, accountability, and oversight in modern environments. It reveals how routine settings can still allow disappearance without detection. Investigators acknowledge that not all unknowns can be resolved through technology alone. Human behavior, environmental complexity, and system limitations interact in ways that resist linear explanation. These cases persist because they lack definitive endpoints rather than because they lack investigative effort. Over time, unresolved disappearances transition from individual cases to collective patterns. These patterns raise broader questions about how disappearance is defined, detected, and interpret it. They also challenge legal, social, and institutional frameworks designed to provide resolution. The absence of answers becomes an enduring feature rather than a temporary phase. For investigators, the challenge lies not only in finding evidence, but in acknowledging when evidence may never surface. For families, uncertainty becomes a permanent condition rather than a stage to overcome. Society often moves on, but unresolved cases remain embedded in records and memory. Each disappearance adds to a growing archive of unanswered questions. These archives reflect the limits of certainty in complex systems. The phenomenon endures because it cannot be conclusively disproven or resolved. It remains a documented reality rather than a theoretical possibility. People continue to vanish without explanation. Investigations continue without closure. The question remains open, suspended between evidence and absence. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you. In the early 21st century, reports began emerging from a small rural community describing an unusual medical phenomenon in which residents were suddenly falling into prolonged states of sleep, lasting days, weeks, and in some cases far longer than medically expected. At first, these cases were treated as isolated incidents, attributed to exhaustion, illness, or individual health conditions, rather than a shared or environmental cause affecting multiple people within the same location. As the number of affected residents increased, local healthcare providers realized that the pattern was abnormal, as individuals of different ages, professions, and health backgrounds were experiencing similar episodes without clear warning signs. Those affected would often fall asleep abruptly during normal daily activities, including work, conversation, or meals, and could not be easily awakened using conventional medical methods. When patients eventually regained consciousness, many reported confusion, memory gaps, headaches, and an altered perception of time, as if they had slept only briefly, despite having been unconscious for extended periods. The phenomenon quickly disrupted daily life within the village, as schools, workplaces, and essential services were affected by the unpredictable loss of conscious residents. Families were forced to care for loved ones who appeared physically stable but remained unresponsive, creating emotional strain and uncertainty about potential long-term effects. Medical examinations revealed that vital signs in sleeping individuals remained largely normal, with stable heart rates, breathing patterns, and brain activity inconsistent with coma or typical sleep disorders. This contradiction puzzled doctors, as patients did not fit diagnostic criteria for known neurological conditions such as narcolepsy, encephalitis, or prolonged coma states. As local resources became overwhelmed, regional and national health authorities were notified, prompting broader investigation into the cause of the unexplained sleep episodes. Specialists from neurology, toxicology, infectious disease, and environmental health were brought in to assess patients and evaluate possible external factors. Initial hypotheses focused on infectious agents, including viral or bacterial causes that might affect brain function, yet laboratory tests repeatedly failed to identify a consistent pathogen. Toxic exposure was also considered, as environmental contaminants can sometimes induce neurological symptoms affecting consciousness and sleep regulation. Investigators examined water sources, air quality, food supplies, and household materials for traces of chemicals or pollutants that could explain the symptoms. Despite extensive testing, no single toxic substance was identified at levels sufficient to account for the widespread and recurring nature of the condition. The absence of a clear medical explanation intensified concern among residents, many of whom feared the phenomenon could spread further or worsen over time. Media coverage brought national and international attention to the village, framing the situation as a medical mystery rather than a localized health issue. This attention increased pressure on authorities to provide answers, even as evidence remained inconclusive and theories continued to evolve. Doctors noted that the episodes appeared cyclical for some individuals, with residents falling asleep multiple times over weeks or months. The unpredictable recurrence complicated treatment, as patients could not be reliably monitored or protected from entering sleep during potentially dangerous situations. Some residents attempted to leave the village temporarily, only to experience similar symptoms upon returning, suggesting a possible location-based trigger. This observation reinforced suspicions that environmental factors played a role, even though direct evidence remained elusive. Investigators began mapping cases geographically, searching for patterns related to housing, proximity to industrial sites, or geological features. Early mapping suggested clusters, but these patterns shifted over time, undermining attempts to isolate a single source. The phenomenon challenged conventional medical frameworks, as it did not behave like a typical outbreak, poisoning event, or genetic condition. As weeks turned into months, frustration grew among both residents and researchers, who struggled to reconcile observable symptoms with the lack of measurable cause. Authorities implemented precautionary measures, including temporary relocation and increased medical monitoring, though these actions offered limited relief. Children were particularly affected, raising concerns about developmental consequences and long-term neurological impact. Parents reported changes in behavior and cognitive function following repeated sleep episodes, though these effects varied widely. Medical teams conducted imaging studies, including brain scans, which failed to reveal structural abnormalities explaining the condition. This absence of visible damage further deepened the mystery, as symptoms suggested functional disruption rather than physical injury. Researchers began considering less conventional explanations, including interactions between environmental stressors and human physiology. Even so, each proposed explanation accounted for only part of the observed phenomenon. The lack of a unifying theory made it difficult to communicate clear guidance to the affected community. Residents lived with constant uncertainty, unsure when the next episode might occur or how long it would last. Daily routines were disrupted as people avoided driving, operating machinery, or engaging in activities that required sustained alertness. The village gradually became defined by the phenomenon, attracting researchers while burdening residents with unwanted attention. Despite intense scrutiny, no definitive cause was identified during the early stages of investigation. The mystery persisted not because of inaction, but because available evidence refused to converge on a single explanation. Over time, the situation raised broader questions about the limits of medical knowledge in the face of unusual collective symptoms. The phenomenon blurred distinctions between individual illness and environmental influence. It also exposed challenges in diagnosing conditions that lack clear biomarkers or consistent clinical patterns. For the affected community, the experience was both medical and psychological, combining physical symptoms with prolonged uncertainty. The village's identity became inseparable from the unexplained sleep episodes. At this stage, the mystery remained open, defined by unanswered questions rather than confirmed conclusions. As investigations continued, authorities expanded their focus to include geological factors, examining whether naturally occurring substances beneath the village could be influencing air quality or neurological function over prolonged exposure. Researchers studied soil composition and underground formations, noting the presence of minerals that, under certain conditions, could release gases capable of affecting human consciousness or cognitive processes. Attention turned toward abandoned industrial activity in the region, including former mining operations that might have left residual contaminants undetected by initial surface-level testing. Environmental experts considered whether slow, chronic exposure rather than acute poisoning could explain the delayed and recurring onset of symptoms among residents. In parallel, medical researchers revisited neurological explanations, analyzing whether rare sleep disorders could manifest collectively under shared environmental stressors. Some specialists suggested a condition resembling encephalopathy, though typical diagnostic markers remained absent in blood tests and imaging results. The lack of clear physiological damage challenged assumptions that severe symptoms must correspond to visible medical evidence. As theories multiplied, communication between researchers and residents became increasingly complex, with uncertainty undermining public trust. Temporary relocation of affected individuals led to partial improvement in some cases, though symptoms often returned when residents came back to the village. This pattern strengthened arguments for a location-based factor, even as its precise nature remained unidentified. International medical communities began monitoring the case, comparing it with historical incidents involving unexplained mass sleep or lethargy. Similar cases from the past were examined, though differences in scale, duration, and context limited their usefulness as direct comparisons. Over time, investigators acknowledged that the phenomenon did not fit neatly within existing medical categories. This recognition marked a shift from seeking immediate answers toward documenting patterns and mitigating risk. Authorities focused on protecting residents rather than solving the mystery outright, emphasizing monitoring, education, and precaution. Despite these efforts, episodes continued sporadically, reinforcing the sense that the underlying cause had not been addressed. Some residents eventually chose to leave permanently, unwilling to live with ongoing uncertainty and disruption. Others remained, adapting their lives around the possibility of sudden sleep episodes. The long-term psychological impact on the community became evident as stress and anxiety compounded physical symptoms. Researchers debated whether the phenomenon represented a single cause or multiple overlapping factors. This complexity complicated efforts to design targeted interventions or preventive measures. As media attention faded, scientific investigation slowed, leaving many questions unresolved. The case gradually transitioned from active emergency to unresolved medical anomaly. Documentation continued, preserving data for future analysis as methods and understanding evolve. The village's experience entered medical literature as a rare example of unexplained collective sleep disorder. It remains cited as a reminder of how environmental, neurological, and social factors can intersect unpredictably. The phenomenon challenges confidence in medicine's ability to explain all observed symptoms. It also highlights the importance of humility in scientific inquiry when evidence resists interpretation. For those affected, the lack of explanation does not diminish the reality of their experience. The village became known not for its location, but for what happened there. The mystery persists because no single explanation accounts for all observed facts. Each theory resolves some questions while leaving others unanswered. The absence of definitive conclusions has allowed speculation to persist. Yet documented evidence confirms that the events themselves were real. The case continues to be referenced in discussions of unexplained medical phenomena. It stands as an example of how collective experiences can defy conventional diagnosis. The mystery remains open, awaiting future insight or discovery. Time has not erased the unanswered questions, nor has it provided clarity. The village's story remains suspended between observation and explanation. Its legacy is defined by uncertainty rather than resolution. The phenomenon remains unexplained despite sincere investigation. Medical science acknowledges its limits in this case. The silence around the cause continues. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you. Commercial aviation is one of the most monitored and regulated forms of transportation in the modern world, which is why cases involving aircraft that vanish without a clear explanation remain deeply unsettling and difficult to reconcile with assumptions of technological reliability and constant global surveillance. This story focuses on a real aviation mystery involving a flight that departed as scheduled, followed its planned route, and maintained normal communication before ultimately failing to arrive at its destination, leaving behind questions that official investigations have not fully resolved. The aircraft involved was operating a routine commercial service, carrying passengers and crew whose identities, tickets, and travel plans were fully documented, eliminating any doubt that the flight itself was real and properly authorized. Weather conditions along the planned route were monitored and considered within acceptable operational limits, with no immediate indication that extreme meteorological events would force an emergency diversion or grounding prior to departure. Air traffic control records show that the flight maintained normal radio contact during the early stages of its journey, reporting no mechanical problems, unusual behavior, or distress signals. Standard procedures require continuous monitoring of altitude, speed, and heading, all of which initially appeared consistent with the flight plan filed before takeoff. At a certain point during the flight, communication with the aircraft ceased unexpectedly, without any prior warning, emergency call, or indication of escalating technical difficulty. The sudden loss of contact immediately triggered concern among air traffic controllers, as modern aircraft are designed with multiple redundant communication systems. Attempts to re-establish radio contact were unsuccessful, prompting controllers to alert nearby aircraft and initiate emergency protocols. When the flight failed to arrive at its destination within the expected time window, it became clear that an abnormal and potentially serious incident had occurred. Search and rescue operations were launched rapidly, involving aviation authorities, military assets, and emergency response teams tasked with locating the missing aircraft. Initial search areas were based on the aircraft's last known position, radar data, and projected flight path, creating a defined zone of interest for recovery efforts. Despite extensive aerial and maritime searches, no immediate wreckage, debris, or emergency signals were detected within the expected area. The absence of physical evidence during early search phases raised concerns, as aircraft accidents typically leave identifiable debris fields or signal transmissions. Investigators began reviewing radar records more closely, examining whether the aircraft had deviated from its assigned route before disappearing. Radar data suggested no abrupt changes in altitude or heading prior to the loss of contact, complicating theories involving sudden mechanical failure or pilot error. Maintenance records were scrutinized to determine whether the aircraft had any unresolved technical issues or recent repairs that could have contributed to an in-flight emergency. These records showed no major concerns that would normally justify grounding the aircraft or raising safety alarms. Attention then shifted to cockpit voice recordings and flight data systems, though accessing such information required recovery of onboard recording devices. Without physical access to these systems, investigators were forced to rely on indirect evidence and reconstruction based on available data. The lack of a distress signal was particularly troubling, as crews are trained to transmit emergency codes even under severe conditions. This silence suggested either a sudden incapacitation or a scenario in which the crew was unable to communicate. As days passed without discovery, public concern grew, and the incident began to attract international attention. Media coverage emphasized the mystery of how a modern aircraft could simply vanish in controlled airspace. Aviation experts offered cautious commentary, stressing the limits of available information and the need for systematic investigation. Authorities avoided premature conclusions, focusing instead on gathering verified data and coordinating search efforts. Families of passengers faced uncertainty, receiving limited updates as search operations continued without definitive results. This emotional dimension underscored the human cost of unresolved aviation incidents. As the search expanded, investigators considered less conventional possibilities, while remaining grounded in documented evidence. Satellite data, radar gaps, and communication handoffs between control regions were examined for inconsistencies. Each system involved in tracking the flight was reviewed to identify potential failures or blind spots. The complexity of global air traffic management revealed how even advanced systems rely on multiple interconnected components. Any failure or gap within this network could contribute to incomplete information during critical moments. Investigators emphasized that disappearance does not necessarily imply destruction, though the absence of contact made survival scenarios increasingly uncertain. The case highlighted the limitations of surveillance coverage in certain regions, despite advances in aviation technology. As search efforts continued with diminishing leads, questions began to outweigh answers. Why was no emergency signal transmitted? Why was no debris immediately located? Why did monitoring systems provide so little clarity? Each unanswered question deepened the mystery surrounding the flight. Official statements acknowledged the unusual nature of the case, while reaffirming commitment to continued investigation. Analysts began comparing the incident to other historical aviation disappearances. Similarities and differences were noted, though none provided a direct explanation. The flight became defined not by what was known, but by what could not be confirmed. At this stage, the incident stood as a reminder that even routine flights can enter unexplained silence. As the search extended over wider areas, investigators reassessed assumptions about the aircraft's trajectory, considering whether unexpected deviations or unreported course changes could have moved the plane beyond initial search zones. Ocean currents, wind patterns, and fuel endurance calculations were incorporated into updated models, altering predictions about where wreckage might realistically be found if the aircraft had gone down. Despite these refinements, repeated search efforts failed to locate conclusive physical evidence, reinforcing concerns that the disappearance involved circumstances not accounted for in standard accident scenarios. Attention turned to potential failures in tracking systems, including gaps in radar coverage and reliance on transponder signals that cease once power is lost or manually disabled. This reliance exposed vulnerabilities in global monitoring infrastructure, particularly over remote regions where continuous surveillance cannot be guaranteed. Investigators examined whether electrical failure could explain the sudden silence, though such a scenario would still likely allow some form of distress transmission. The possibility of rapid decompression or fire was considered, yet these events often leave detectable traces or partial communications before loss of control. Human factors were also analyzed, including crew workload, fatigue, and decision-making under unexpected conditions. Without cockpit recordings or recovered wreckage, these assessments remain speculative rather than evidentiary. Aviation history shows that rare but catastrophic sequences can unfold quickly, leaving little opportunity for corrective action or communication. Still, the absence of any warning continues to distinguish this case from most documented aviation accidents. International aviation authorities collaborated to share data, expertise, and resources, reflecting the seriousness of the unresolved disappearance. Public confidence in aviation safety was tested as the case challenged assumptions about traceability and accountability. Investigators emphasized that disappearance does not equate to impossibility, but rather highlights gaps between expectation and reality. Over time, the lack of findings shifted the investigation from recovery toward analysis and prevention. Recommendations emerged aimed at improving aircraft tracking, data transmission, and real-time monitoring. These changes acknowledged that existing systems were not infallible, particularly in extreme or unexpected scenarios. The mystery also influenced public discourse about transparency and information sharing during aviation crises. Families of those on board continued to seek clarity, confronting prolonged uncertainty without definitive answers. The emotional impact persisted long after search operations scaled back. As official investigations concluded without resolution, the case entered the category of unsolved aviation mysteries. It joined a small group of incidents where technology, procedure, and investigation failed to deliver certainty. Analysts revisited the evidence periodically, hoping that new data or methods might one day clarify what happened. Advances in satellite tracking and data analytics renewed interest, though no breakthroughs emerged. The disappearance remained defined by absence rather than discovery. Each theory explained some aspects while leaving critical questions unanswered. Mechanical failure, human error, environmental factors, and systemic limitations were all considered without definitive confirmation. The case underscores how complex systems can fail in unexpected ways. It also illustrates how modern confidence in technology can be challenged by rare events. The flight's fate remains unknown, despite extensive effort and international cooperation. Its story continues to be referenced in discussions about aviation safety and system resilience. The mystery persists because evidence remains incomplete. Without physical confirmation, certainty cannot be achieved. The disappearance serves as a reminder of the limits of monitoring and control. It highlights how unanswered questions can endure even in highly regulated environments. The incident remains studied not for sensationalism, but for the lessons it may still offer. It challenges assumptions about constant visibility in modern transportation. The case reflects the tension between expectation and reality. As time passes, the absence of answers becomes part of the story itself. The flight exists in records, memories, and unresolved files. Its silence continues to provoke investigation and reflection. The mystery endures because resolution remains elusive. Modern aviation has learned from the unknown as much as from confirmed failures. The unanswered questions remain. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you. In the early 1990s, residents of Taos, New Mexico began reporting a strange, persistent low-frequency sound that seemed to have no identifiable source, a phenomenon that would later become known as the Taos Hum and spark decades of investigation, debate, and unresolved questions. The sound was described as a continuous hum, rumble, or droning noise, often compared to a distant engine or idling truck, audible mostly at night and indoors, and experienced by only a small percentage of the local population. What made the reports unusual was not only the sound itself, but the fact that most residents could not hear it at all, creating a divide between those affected and those completely unaware of its existence. Individuals who reported hearing the hum described significant discomfort, including headaches, insomnia, dizziness, difficulty concentrating, and a persistent sense of unease that interfered with daily life and emotional well-being. Many listeners claimed the sound followed them from place to place, remaining audible indoors even when they traveled away from Taos, reinforcing the belief that the phenomenon was not tied to a single mechanical source. As reports increased, local authorities and media outlets took notice, prompting initial inquiries into whether industrial equipment, power lines, or military installations could be responsible for the unexplained noise. Early investigations focused on identifying conventional explanations, such as electrical infrastructure, ventilation systems, or distant traffic. Yet none of these sources could be conclusively linked to the reported experiences. In response to growing public concern, the University of New Mexico organized a formal study in 1993, assembling scientists, engineers, and acoustics experts to examine the phenomenon systematically. Researchers conducted field measurements using sensitive audio equipment, attempting to detect low-frequency sounds or vibrations that might explain the reports, particularly in the infrasonic range. Despite extensive testing, investigators failed to identify a consistent external sound source that could account for what listeners were experiencing. The study found that while low-level background noises existed, none matched the intensity, persistence, or location-specific characteristics described by those affected by the hum. This absence of measurable evidence complicated the investigation, raising the possibility that the phenomenon might involve subjective perception rather than a detectable environmental source. Some researchers proposed that the hum could be related to infrasound, low-frequency vibrations below the threshold of human hearing that can still cause physical sensations or discomfort. Infrasound can originate from natural sources such as wind, seismic activity, or atmospheric pressure changes. Yet no consistent environmental pattern was identified in Taos during reported episodes. Another hypothesis suggested that the hum might be generated internally, potentially linked to conditions affecting the auditory system, such as tinnitus or heightened sensitivity to normally unnoticed bodily sounds. However, many listeners rejected this explanation, insisting that the sound was external, directional, and distinct from known auditory conditions they had previously experienced. Psychological explanations were also considered, including stress, suggestion, or mass psychogenic illness, though the limited number of affected individuals made such theories difficult to substantiate. Unlike classic cases of mass hysteria, reports of the Taos Hum were sporadic, personal, and often accompanied by frustration rather than collective emotional reinforcement. The phenomenon's selectivity raised further questions, as affected individuals came from varied backgrounds, ages, and professions, with no clear demographic pattern. Some listeners attempted to record the sound using personal equipment, yet these efforts consistently failed to capture audio evidence matching their experiences. This inability to document the hum intensified skepticism among those who could not hear it, while deepening distress among those who could. Over time, similar reports emerged from other locations around the world, suggesting that the Taos Hum might be part of a broader, poorly understood phenomenon. Comparable low-frequency hums were reported in parts of Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia, often sharing similar characteristics despite geographic separation. These global reports challenged explanations based solely on local infrastructure or regional environmental factors. Some scientists proposed that the hum could be related to modern technology, such as distant industrial operations or telecommunication systems, though no direct links were established. Military activity was also considered, given the presence of testing facilities in parts of New Mexico, but officials denied involvement and no corroborating evidence emerged. The persistence of the hum, combined with the lack of confirmation, created tension between subjective experience and empirical investigation. For those affected, the phenomenon was undeniably real, regardless of scientific uncertainty or skepticism. The Taos Hum began to represent a broader challenge in scientific inquiry: how to study phenomena that are experienced personally but resist objective measurement. As years passed, reports continued intermittently, suggesting the phenomenon had neither intensified nor disappeared entirely. Some listeners reported that the hum diminished over time, while others claimed it remained constant or returned unpredictably. This variability further complicated efforts to identify consistent triggers or environmental correlations. Researchers revisited earlier data with improved analytical tools, yet conclusions remained largely unchanged. The hum's elusive nature placed it at the intersection of acoustics, neurology, psychology, and environmental science. Each discipline offered partial explanations, none capable of fully accounting for all reported characteristics. The lack of resolution did not diminish interest, as the phenomenon continued to challenge assumptions about perception and reality. For skeptics, the Taos Hum remained unproven and anecdotal. For listeners, it remained an intrusive and unsettling presence. This divide highlighted the difficulty of validating experiences that cannot be reliably reproduced or measured. The hum's persistence over decades suggests that it is not a transient anomaly, but an enduring, unresolved phenomenon. Whether caused by environmental factors, physiological mechanisms, or an interaction between the two remains unclear. The Taos Hum occupies a rare category of mystery, grounded in real reports yet lacking definitive explanation. Its study reveals the limits of current investigative tools when confronted with subjective phenomena. The absence of answers has not silenced the hum, either physically or metaphorically. Instead, it continues to resonate as a reminder that not all experiences fit neatly within existing scientific frameworks. As scientific interest continued, researchers attempted to isolate environmental variables that might contribute to the Taos Hum, examining factors such as atmospheric pressure, seismic activity, electromagnetic fields, and industrial noise propagation across long distances. Despite these efforts, no consistent correlation emerged between reported experiences and measurable environmental conditions, leaving investigators without a reliable external trigger to explain the phenomenon. Some studies explored the possibility that the hum resulted from a combination of low-frequency sound and individual auditory sensitivity, where only certain people could perceive specific vibrations under particular conditions. This explanation suggested that the phenomenon might exist objectively, yet remain undetectable to most individuals and conventional recording equipment. Critics argued that if such a sound were truly present, it should be measurable at least intermittently, especially given advances in acoustic monitoring technology. The failure to detect a signal reinforced alternative theories focused on neurological or physiological mechanisms within the human auditory system. Conditions such as low-frequency tinnitus were proposed, though many listeners rejected this explanation, stating the hum behaved differently from known auditory disorders. Unlike tinnitus, the hum was often described as directional, spatially localized, and influenced by external surroundings rather than constant internal noise. Psychological explanations were revisited, including stress-induced perception and heightened sensory awareness, yet these theories struggled to explain consistent similarities across unrelated cases. Importantly, the Taos Hum did not follow patterns typical of mass suggestion, as reports were not clustered in time or driven by collective events. Many individuals reported experiencing the hum before learning that others had similar experiences, reducing the likelihood of expectation or suggestion as primary causes. This independence of reports strengthened arguments that the phenomenon could not be dismissed solely as psychological. As attention grew, researchers began comparing Taos with other locations reporting similar hums, identifying overlapping characteristics despite different environments. These comparisons suggested that the Taos Hum might be part of a global phenomenon rather than an isolated local anomaly. Reports from places such as Bristol in the United Kingdom and Windsor in Canada described nearly identical low-frequency sounds and associated symptoms. The geographic spread complicated explanations tied to specific infrastructure, climate, or regional activity. Some scientists speculated that modern civilization itself might contribute indirectly through cumulative low-frequency noise generated by distant industrial systems. Such noise could travel vast distances under certain atmospheric conditions, becoming perceptible only to sensitive listeners. However, this hypothesis remains difficult to test conclusively due to the diffuse and variable nature of low-frequency sound propagation. Over time, funding and institutional interest declined, leaving much of the research fragmented and inconclusive. Without a clear framework for study, the Taos Hum gradually shifted from active investigation to unresolved curiosity. Yet for those affected, the lack of explanation did not diminish the impact on daily life. The phenomenon continued to disrupt sleep, concentration, and emotional well-being for some listeners. Their experiences highlight the human cost of unresolved phenomena that fall outside conventional scientific categories. The Taos Hum occupies a unique position among mysteries, rooted in credible personal testimony rather than dramatic physical evidence. Its persistence challenges assumptions about the completeness of scientific understanding. It also exposes the difficulty of studying phenomena that exist at the boundary between perception and environment. The hum raises questions about how reality is defined when experience cannot be consistently measured. In this sense, the mystery is not only about sound, but about the limits of observation itself. The Taos Hum remains unresolved, not because it lacks witnesses, but because it resists confirmation. Each proposed explanation accounts for some aspects, while leaving others unexplained. The phenomenon continues to defy simple categorization. It remains unclear whether future technology will provide definitive answers. Until then, the hum persists as an unresolved intersection of science, perception, and uncertainty. Its existence reminds researchers that absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. The Taos Hum continues to be reported, studied, and debated decades after its first documentation. It endures as a modern mystery grounded in real experience. The phenomenon challenges confidence in objective measurement as the sole arbiter of reality. For those who hear it, the hum remains undeniable. For those who do not, it remains unproven. This divide defines the mystery itself. The Taos Hum occupies a space where certainty collapses. It resists closure and explanation. The sound remains unheard by many, yet unforgettable to some. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you. In the late 16th century, England sought to establish a permanent presence in the New World, motivated by expansion, resources, and competition with Spain, setting the stage for one of the most enduring mysteries in American history: the complete disappearance of the Roanoke colony. Roanoke Island is located off the coast of present-day North Carolina, a region explored by English expeditions during an era marked by ambition, uncertainty, and limited understanding of unfamiliar lands, climates, and indigenous societies. The first English attempt to settle Roanoke occurred in 1585, primarily as a military outpost, but it struggled almost immediately due to supply shortages, harsh conditions, and deteriorating relations with local Native American tribes. That initial settlement was ultimately abandoned, and its colonists returned to England, highlighting the difficulty of sustaining a remote colony across the Atlantic with limited logistical support and unreliable communication. Despite this failure, English leaders remained committed to colonization, viewing Roanoke as strategically important and believing that lessons learned from earlier mistakes could ensure future success. In 1587, a second group of settlers arrived at Roanoke under the leadership of John White, tasked not only with establishing a colony, but also with creating a lasting English presence in the region. This new group consisted of approximately 100 men, women, and children, signaling a shift from military occupation toward permanent settlement and family-based colonization. Among the settlers was Virginia Dare, John White's granddaughter, who became the first English child born in the New World, symbolizing hope for a stable future in unfamiliar territory. From the beginning, the colonists faced serious challenges, including limited food supplies, unfamiliar agricultural conditions, and strained relations with neighboring indigenous groups. These difficulties made the colony heavily dependent on resupply missions from England, placing its survival at the mercy of transatlantic voyages and political circumstances overseas. Shortly after the colony was established, the settlers persuaded John White to return to England to secure additional supplies and assistance, believing his absence would be temporary. White departed with the expectation of returning quickly, leaving the colonists behind with instructions to relocate inland if necessary, and to leave a clear sign if they moved under duress. However, events in Europe soon interfered with White's plans, as England became embroiled in conflict with Spain, culminating in the threat posed by the Spanish Armada. Due to the war, White was unable to secure a ship for his return voyage, and years passed before he could attempt to rejoin the Roanoke colonists. During this time, the fate of the settlers remained unknown, as no communication was possible between the colony and England. In 1590, John White finally returned to Roanoke Island, 3 years after his departure, hoping to find the settlement intact despite the long delay. Upon arrival, White and his crew discovered that the colony had been completely abandoned, with no trace of the settlers present. Buildings had been dismantled rather than destroyed, suggesting an organized departure rather than a violent attack or sudden catastrophe. No bodies were found, no graves identified, and no signs of battle or struggle were visible at the site. The only significant clue left behind was the word Croatoan, carved into a wooden post, with the letters Crow carved into a nearby tree. The absence of the previously agreed-upon distress symbol indicated that the settlers may not have left under immediate threat or coercion. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island, and also the name of a Native American group known to have had relatively friendly relations with the colonists. This discovery suggested that the settlers may have relocated voluntarily, possibly seeking assistance or integration with the Croatoan people. However, Attempts to investigate Croatoan Island were hindered by poor weather and damaged ships, preventing White from pursuing the only clear lead. Forced to abandon the search, White returned to England without answers, never learning the fate of the colony he had left behind. Over time, the disappearance of the Roanoke settlers became known as the mystery of the lost colony, raising questions that would persist for centuries. Contemporary records offered little additional information, leaving historians dependent on fragmentary accounts and indirect evidence. Some theories propose that the settlers integrated with local Native American tribes, abandoning English identity in order to survive. Others suggest that disease, famine, or environmental hardship weakened the colony before any relocation could occur. More extreme theories involve attacks by hostile groups or secret intervention by rival European powers, though no definitive evidence supports these claims. Archaeological efforts have uncovered scattered artifacts suggesting possible English presence beyond Roanoke Island, but none conclusively confirm the settlers' fate. The lack of physical evidence has made it difficult to validate any single explanation, leaving the mystery open to interpretation. Oral histories from indigenous communities have been examined for clues, though their reliability is debated due to the passage of time. Written records from the period remain incomplete, limiting the ability to reconstruct events with certainty. The Roanoke disappearance highlights the fragility of early colonial ventures and the risks faced by settlers in unfamiliar environments. It also illustrates how historical mysteries can emerge, not from dramatic events, but from silence and absence of information. The lost colony stands as one of the earliest examples of a community vanishing without clear explanation in recorded American history. Its story has influenced literature, folklore, and popular imagination, often blending documented facts with speculation. Despite centuries of study, no theory has achieved universal acceptance among historians and archaeologists. Each proposed explanation addresses some aspects of the mystery while leaving others unresolved. The case demonstrates how limited documentation can transform ordinary hardship into enduring mystery. Roanoke remains a symbol of uncertainty at the beginning of English colonization in North America. The absence of closure continues to invite investigation, reinterpretation, and debate. What happened to the settlers may never be known with certainty. The lost colony of Roanoke endures because its disappearance left questions without answers. One of the most widely discussed theories suggests that the Roanoke settlers gradually integrated with neighboring indigenous communities, adopting new customs and survival strategies as a practical response to isolation, limited supplies, and the absence of promised resupply from England. Supporters of this theory point to reports from later English settlers describing Native American groups with lighter skin, gray eyes, or knowledge of English words. Although such accounts are inconsistent and difficult to verify through archaeological evidence. Another explanation proposes that the settlers attempted to relocate inland to find more fertile land and safer conditions, potentially dispersing into smaller groups that became increasingly difficult to track over time. Environmental factors may also have played a role, as tree ring data indicates that the region experienced a severe drought during the years surrounding the colony's disappearance, which would have dramatically reduced food availability. Prolonged drought could have intensified tensions between settlers and indigenous groups, forcing difficult choices between cooperation, migration, or conflict in an already fragile survival situation. Some historians argue that disease may have weakened the colony, as European settlers lacked immunity to local illnesses and faced unsanitary conditions that could spread infection rapidly. In such circumstances, even a small outbreak could have led to significant loss of life, making organized relocation or long-term survival increasingly unlikely. More aggressive theories suggest the settlers may have been attacked by hostile groups, though the absence of physical evidence such as weapons, remains, or signs of destruction weakens this possibility. Rival European powers, particularly Spain, have also been proposed as possible actors, given geopolitical tensions of the period. Yet no Spanish records confirm an attack on Roanoke. Archaeological excavations on Roanoke Island have uncovered English artifacts, but none clearly date beyond the colony's abandonment, offering limited insight into the settlers' final movements. Investigations at nearby sites have produced objects resembling English tools, though these finds remain controversial and open to multiple interpretations. The ambiguity of material evidence highlights the difficulty of reconstructing events when settlements leave minimal physical traces and documentation is sparse. Oral traditions from Native American communities have been examined cautiously, as they may preserve fragments of historical memory while also evolving over centuries of retelling. Historians must balance respect for these narratives with the need for corroborating evidence, a challenge common in early colonial research. The Roanoke mystery illustrates how historical silence can be more powerful than recorded events, transforming absence into enduring fascination. Unlike many historical mysteries, Roanoke lacks a dramatic final moment, offering no battle, catastrophe, or clear resolution to anchor interpretation. Instead, the disappearance unfolded quietly, leaving behind only indirect clues and unanswered questions that resist definitive explanation. This quiet vanishing challenges assumptions that major historical events must leave clear evidence or documented conclusions. Over time, Roanoke has become a symbol of uncertainty at the origins of English America, representing both ambition and vulnerability. The mystery persists partly because it reflects the realities of early colonization, where survival depended on fragile supply lines and uncertain alliances. Each new archaeological discovery offers hope of resolution, yet often raises additional questions rather than providing closure. Modern research continues to apply new methods, including environmental analysis and advanced dating techniques, to reassess existing evidence. Despite these efforts, no single theory fully accounts for all known facts surrounding the colony's disappearance. The lack of consensus ensures that Roanoke remains open to interpretation, inviting both scholarly debate and public imagination. The mystery also serves as a reminder that history is shaped as much by what is lost as by what is preserved. Roanoke demonstrates how communities can vanish from records without dramatic explanation, leaving historians to reconstruct possibilities rather than certainties. This uncertainty challenges modern expectations of historical clarity and resolution. The lost colony continues to inspire research because it represents an unresolved intersection of human ambition, environmental hardship, and historical silence. Its story remains relevant as a cautionary example of early colonial vulnerability and the limits of historical reconstruction. Each generation revisits Roanoke with new tools, perspectives, and assumptions, yet the core mystery endures. The absence of definitive answers has allowed Roanoke to occupy a unique place in historical memory. It stands as one of the earliest recorded disappearances of an entire community without confirmed explanation. The mystery persists not because of sensational evidence, but because of unanswered questions grounded in documented history. Roanoke's legacy is defined by uncertainty rather than conclusion. This uncertainty continues to shape how the story is told and interpreted. The lost colony of Roanoke remains a subject of investigation, debate, and reflection. It highlights the challenges historians face when evidence is incomplete or permanently lost. The disappearance forces acceptance that some historical questions may never be resolved. Roanoke reminds us that history does not always provide closure. Its silence continues to invite inquiry. The mystery survives through absence rather than revelation. What truly happened to the settlers remains unknown. Interpretation fills the space left by missing evidence. The lost colony endures as an unanswered chapter of early American history. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you. In the early 20th century, a discovery beneath the Mediterranean Sea would challenge fundamental assumptions about the technological capabilities of the ancient world, revealing an object so complex that even modern scientists initially struggled to understand its purpose, construction, and implications for the history of science. This discovery occurred in 1901, when Greek sponge divers exploring a shipwreck near the small island of Antikythera encountered bronze fragments embedded in rock, an unremarkable finding at first glance that would later prove to be one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries ever recorded. The shipwreck dated back to the 1st century BCE, a period associated with early astronomy, philosophy, and mechanical experimentation. Yet no historical records suggested the existence of advanced mechanical devices comparable to what would eventually be reconstructed from the recovered fragments. Among statues, pottery, and everyday objects, researchers noticed corroded bronze pieces containing gear-like structures, prompting early speculation that the fragments might belong to some form of mechanical instrument rather than decorative or utilitarian ship cargo. Initial examinations were limited by the heavy corrosion accumulated over 2,000 years underwater, obscuring the internal structure and preventing investigators from fully appreciating the device's complexity or original configuration. For decades, the fragments remained largely misunderstood, catalogued as curious but isolated artifacts, while prevailing academic opinion dismissed the possibility that ancient civilizations possessed the knowledge required to produce sophisticated mechanical systems. It was not until the mid-20th century that renewed interest and improved imaging techniques allowed researchers to examine the internal mechanisms concealed within the corroded bronze mass. X-ray analysis revealed an intricate arrangement of interlocking gears, some with precisely cut teeth, arranged in a manner suggesting intentional design rather than accidental assembly or decorative craftsmanship. The presence of dozens of finely engineered gears immediately distinguished the Antikythera mechanism from any previously known artifact of the ancient world, raising questions about who could have built it and for what purpose. Mechanical complexity of this level was previously believed to have emerged more than a millennium later, during the development of medieval astronomical clocks in Europe. This temporal discrepancy forced historians to reconsider long-standing assumptions about the linear progression of technological advancement throughout human history. Researchers began reconstructing the device virtually and physically, attempting to determine how the gears interacted and what functions the mechanism might have performed. Detailed analysis revealed that the gears were arranged in multiple layers, indicating a compact but highly sophisticated design capable of modeling complex cyclical processes. Evidence gradually emerged that the mechanism was not random machinery, but a carefully engineered device intended to track astronomical phenomena with remarkable precision. Inscriptions discovered on the fragments provided critical clues, containing references to celestial cycles, eclipses, and planetary movements, suggesting an astronomical function rather than a navigational or mechanical utility. Further study indicated that the device could predict solar and lunar eclipses, track the phases of the moon, and model the movements of known planets as understood by ancient Greek astronomy. These findings positioned the Antikythera mechanism as a form of analog computer, capable of performing calculations through mechanical motion rather than abstract mathematics. The concept of a computing device existing in antiquity challenged conventional definitions of computation, expanding the term beyond electronic systems to include mechanical representations of mathematical relationships. Precision required to manufacture such gears implied advanced knowledge of metallurgy, geometry, and mechanical engineering far exceeding what historians attributed to ancient civilizations. Each gear tooth had to be cut with accuracy, as even small errors would compound across the system, rendering long-term predictions unreliable. This level of precision suggested not only technical skill, but also a deep theoretical understanding of astronomical cycles and mathematical ratios. Scholars began searching historical texts for references to similar devices, finding indirect mentions of complex astronomical instruments described by ancient authors such as Cicero. Cicero wrote of a device created by Archimedes that could model the motions of celestial bodies, a description long considered exaggerated or metaphorical. The Antikythera mechanism provided physical evidence that such descriptions may have been accurate, lending credibility to ancient accounts previously dismissed by modern scholars. This realization raised further questions about how widespread such knowledge might have been, and why no other devices of comparable complexity had survived. One possibility is that similar mechanisms existed, but were lost due to material decay, recycling of bronze, or destruction during periods of political and social upheaval. Another possibility is that the knowledge required to build such devices was held by a small group of specialists, limiting production and distribution. The mechanism's presence aboard a ship suggests it may have been transported as a valuable object, possibly commissioned for educational, scientific, or elite purposes. Its intended audience remains uncertain, though its complexity implies use by individuals trained in astronomy and mathematics rather than the general public. The device likely served as both a predictive tool and a demonstration of cosmic order, reflecting philosophical beliefs linking celestial motion to mathematical harmony. Ancient Greek thinkers often viewed the universe as a system governed by rational laws, and the Antikythera mechanism appears to embody this worldview mechanically. The integration of theoretical astronomy with practical engineering demonstrated a synthesis of knowledge, rarely preserved in physical form from antiquity. As reconstructions improved, researchers identified gear trains corresponding to known astronomical cycles, including the Metonic cycle used to align lunar and solar calendars. Additional gearing represented the Saros cycle, allowing prediction of eclipses based on repeating patterns observed over long periods. These cycles required careful calculation and long-term observation, indicating that the mechanism's creators built upon generations of accumulated astronomical data. The sophistication of these calculations contradicts assumptions that ancient science relied primarily on qualitative observation rather than quantitative modeling. Instead, the Antikythera mechanism demonstrates that ancient astronomers employed mathematical abstraction in ways previously undocumented. The device also challenges distinctions between theoretical science and applied engineering in antiquity, revealing a closer integration than traditionally assumed. Despite extensive study, many aspects of the mechanism remain uncertain, including its complete configuration and whether additional functions were lost with missing fragments. Scholars continue to debate whether the mechanism included planetary displays beyond those currently reconstructed, potentially increasing its complexity even further. Modern imaging techniques, including three-dimensional scanning and advanced tomography, have revealed details invisible to earlier researchers. These technologies have allowed scholars to read previously illegible inscriptions and refine models of the internal gear arrangements. Each new discovery has clarified certain functions, while simultaneously raising new questions about missing components and design intentions. The mechanism's uniqueness remains one of its most puzzling aspects, as no comparable devices from the same period have been recovered. This absence of parallels complicates efforts to place the mechanism within a broader technological tradition. The Antikythera mechanism stands as both an extraordinary achievement and an anomaly within the archaeological record. Its existence suggests that advanced knowledge can emerge, flourish, and disappear without leaving a continuous trace through history. This possibility forces reconsideration of how progress is measured and remembered across civilizations. Rather than representing a sudden anomaly, the mechanism may indicate a lost tradition of mechanical science, interrupted by historical circumstances. At this point in the investigation, the Antikythera mechanism appears less like an isolated invention and more like surviving evidence of a deeper, largely vanished technological lineage. As research progressed, historians began reconsidering how ancient knowledge was transmitted, recognizing that advanced techniques could exist within limited circles without widespread documentation, leaving only rare physical traces that survive by chance rather than through continuous historical record. The Antikythera mechanism's reliance on precise gear ratios implies a deep mathematical framework, suggesting its creators understood proportional relationships and periodic cycles well enough to encode them mechanically with remarkable reliability. Such understanding required long-term astronomical observation, likely spanning generations, indicating institutional continuity in data collection that challenges assumptions about fragmented scientific practice in antiquity. The mechanism's inscriptions, written in ancient Greek, functioned as operating instructions and explanatory labels, reinforcing the interpretation that the device was intended to be used, adjusted, and understood by trained individuals. This usability distinguishes the mechanism from purely ceremonial objects, suggesting practical application rather than symbolic display alone. Scholars have debated whether the device served educational purposes, allowing students to visualize celestial cycles, or whether it functioned as a predictive tool for calendrical regulation and ritual planning. In ancient societies, accurate calendars were essential for agriculture, navigation, and religious observance, making predictive astronomical devices valuable instruments of social coordination. The mechanism's ability to model eclipses would have been particularly significant, as eclipses held cultural, political, and symbolic importance across ancient civilizations. Predicting such events could confer authority, reinforcing the status of those who possessed and understood the device. This raises questions about who commissioned the Antikythera mechanism and what social or political role it may have played within its original context. Some researchers speculate that the device originated in a major center of learning, such as Rhodes, where advanced astronomical study and mechanical experimentation were documented historically. Connections to figures like Archimedes remain speculative, yet the mechanism aligns with descriptions of complex astronomical instruments attributed to his intellectual lineage. If such devices were produced by skilled workshops, their scarcity may reflect limited patronage rather than technical impossibility. The collapse of political stability, loss of institutions, and decline of specialized craftsmanship could explain why similar devices did not survive into later periods. The recycling of bronze for weaponry and currency would have further reduced the likelihood of preservation, erasing material evidence of advanced mechanical traditions. This process highlights how technological history can be shaped as much by loss and destruction as by invention and progress. Modern reconstructions have demonstrated that the mechanism could function as designed, validating theoretical interpretations through practical testing. These reconstructions confirm that ancient engineers achieved mechanical precision previously thought unattainable without modern tools. Yet uncertainties remain regarding missing gears and potential additional displays, leaving the full capabilities of the device unresolved. Each new analytical breakthrough clarifies certain functions while expanding the scope of unanswered questions. The Antikythera mechanism forces historians to reconsider linear models of technological development that assume steady, uninterrupted progress. Instead, it suggests that knowledge can emerge, reach high sophistication, and then disappear due to historical disruption rather than technical limitation. This realization reshapes understanding of ancient science, positioning it as more experimental, quantitative, and innovative than traditionally acknowledged. The mechanism also blurs boundaries between science, philosophy, and craftsmanship, demonstrating their integration with an ancient intellectual practice. Its survival challenges modern confidence in the completeness of historical knowledge, revealing how much may remain undiscovered or permanently lost. The device's uniqueness may reflect not singular genius, but the fragility of material culture across centuries of upheaval. As a result, the Antikythera mechanism functions as both artifact and warning, illustrating how easily advanced understanding can vanish from collective memory. Continued study relies on interdisciplinary collaboration, combining archaeology, astronomy, mathematics, engineering, and history. Each discipline contributes partial insight, yet none alone can fully reconstruct the mechanism's original context or significance. This necessity mirrors the device itself, which integrates multiple forms of knowledge into a single coherent system. The Antikythera mechanism remains one of the strongest challenges to assumptions about ancient technological limits. Its existence demonstrates that innovation does not belong exclusively to modernity. The mechanism reveals a moment when theory and engineering aligned with extraordinary precision. It also reveals how fragile such moments can be within historical timelines. Understanding the device reshapes narratives of progress, loss, and rediscovery. It reminds researchers that absence of evidence does not equate to absence of capability. The mechanism continues to inspire debate, curiosity, and reassessment across scientific and historical fields. Its meaning extends beyond its function, serving as a symbol of forgotten ingenuity. The Antikythera mechanism stands as proof that history still holds unresolved truths. It remains an object that both informs and unsettles modern understanding. The device challenges the belief that ancient knowledge was purely theoretical or symbolic. Instead, it demonstrates practical application of complex mathematical models. This realization invites broader reconsideration of ancient scientific culture. The mechanism's survival is accidental, its implications deliberate. Each fragment recovered carries disproportionate significance. Together, they reshape assumptions about the past. The full story may never be recovered. Yet the evidence already demands revision of accepted narratives. The mystery endures because certainty remains incomplete. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you. The Voynich manuscript is considered one of the most perplexing artifacts in recorded history because every attempt to explain its language, purpose, and origin has failed to produce consensus, despite more than a century of systematic study by linguists, historians, cryptographers, and scientists across multiple disciplines. The manuscript takes its name from Wilfrid Voynich, a Polish book dealer who acquired it in 1912, although evidence suggests the document itself was created hundreds of years earlier, long before modern methods of encryption, linguistic analysis, or historical authentication were available. Scientific carbon dating conducted on the parchment confirms that the manuscript was produced in the early 15th century, firmly placing its physical origin in medieval Europe, even though no known culture from that period produced a written system resembling the text found within its pages. The book consists of approximately 240 pages, though scholars believe some are missing, and each surviving page contains carefully arranged handwritten text accompanied by illustrations that appear deliberate, structured, and consistent rather than decorative, random, or artistically improvised. The most striking feature of the Voynich manuscript is its writing system, composed of unfamiliar symbols arranged in flowing lines that resemble natural language, complete with word spacing, repetition patterns, and apparent grammatical structure that strongly suggests intentional composition. Despite this appearance of linguistic order, no known alphabet, cipher, or historical writing system has been conclusively matched to the manuscript, leaving it isolated from established linguistic families and resistant to traditional methods of translation or phonetic interpretation. Statistical analysis of the text reveals properties similar to real languages, such as predictable word frequencies and structural regularity, a finding that complicates arguments claiming the manuscript is meaningless or composed of random symbols without underlying informational intent. The manuscript is divided into several distinct sections, each identified by its unique illustrations, suggesting that the text addresses multiple subjects rather than presenting a single-ended, continuous narrative or thematic focus throughout the entire document. One prominent section contains drawings of plants, many of which resemble no clearly identifiable botanical species, instead combining recognizable roots, leaves, and stems with features that appear exaggerated, hybridized, or entirely unknown to modern taxonomy. Another section appears astronomical or astrological, featuring circular diagrams, star-like symbols, and zodiac imagery that resembles medieval cosmological representations, while deviating in subtle but significant ways from known astronomical manuscripts of the same era. Some pages depict human figures, predominantly female, immersed in interconnected pools, tubes, and flowing liquids, imagery that has generated extensive debate regarding whether the manuscript relates to medicine, alchemy, physiology, or symbolic ritual practices. These illustrations do not clearly correspond to any single known medical or scientific tradition, complicating attempts to categorize the manuscript within established medieval intellectual frameworks such as herbal medicine, astrology, or natural philosophy. Shortly after Voynich introduced the manuscript to academic circles, cryptographers and linguists began analyzing the text, confident that systematic methods would eventually reveal decipherable code or concealed language beneath its unfamiliar symbols. Early decoding efforts focused on classical substitution ciphers and medieval encryption techniques, assuming that the manuscript concealed a known language beneath layers of intentional obfuscation designed to restrict understanding to select readers. These early attempts failed to produce consistent translations, as proposed solutions could not be applied uniformly across the manuscript or independently verified by other researchers examining the same text. During the 20th century, the Voynich manuscript attracted the attention of professional codebreakers, including individuals who had successfully deciphered complex military encryption systems during wartime intelligence operations. Even these highly skilled cryptanalysts were unable to identify a functional cipher or linguistic structure that produced meaningful, reproducible interpretations of the manuscript's content. As computational tools became available, researchers applied statistical modeling and computer-assisted analysis to the text, hoping increased processing power would expose hidden patterns inaccessible to manual examination. Computer analysis confirmed that the manuscript exhibits internal consistency and structural order, but it failed to reveal any recognizable language, known cipher system, or encoded plaintext beneath the symbols. This paradox, a text that behaves like language but refuses to yield meaning, has become one of the manuscript's most defining and confounding characteristics. One theory proposes that the manuscript encodes a real language using an unknown or deliberately constructed writing system designed to conceal knowledge from readers lacking specific training or contextual understanding. Another hypothesis suggests that the manuscript represents a fully constructed language, created intentionally with its own grammatical rules and vocabulary, rather than derived from any naturally occurring spoken language. Some scholars argue that the manuscript may function as a mnemonic or symbolic reference system, where meaning emerges only through association with external knowledge rather than direct linguistic reading. A more skeptical interpretation claims the manuscript is an elaborate hoax designed to appear linguistically meaningful while conveying no actual information to the reader. Critics of the hoax theory question why someone would invest extraordinary time, skill, and resources into producing a meaningless text, particularly during a historical period when parchment was expensive and labor-intensive to prepare. Additionally, the manuscript's statistical properties are difficult to replicate artificially, especially without modern computational assistance, making deliberate fabrication less plausible than often assumed. The illustrations themselves appear systematic rather than arbitrary, reinforcing the possibility that the manuscript follows an internal logic not yet understood, rather than serving purely deceptive or decorative purposes. Some researchers have proposed that the manuscript may encode specialized scientific or medical knowledge that was experimental, incomplete, or later abandoned, leaving no surviving contextual references. Attempts to match the plant illustrations with known medicinal herbs have produced partial similarities, but no definitive identifications, capable of anchoring the manuscript within a known pharmacological tradition. At this stage of analysis, the Voynich manuscript remains defined not by what scholars have failed to try, but by the extraordinary consistency with which every proposed explanation has fallen short of definitive proof. As research into the Voynich manuscript expanded, scholars began to realize that its resistance to interpretation was not due to lack of effort, but rather to the absence of any external reference capable of confirming meaning, context, or intent behind the symbols used throughout the text. Unlike many historical documents, the manuscript contains no recognizable names, places, dates, or events, removing the contextual anchors that normally allow historians and linguists to situate a text within a broader cultural or historical framework. This absence of reference points makes it impossible to test translations against known facts, as any proposed interpretation lacks independent verification beyond internal consistency, which alone is insufficient to establish credibility. Over time, researchers attempted to analyze the manuscript by section, assuming each illustrated category might correspond to a specific subject such as botany, astronomy, medicine, or alchemy, thereby narrowing the range of possible meanings. Botanical analysis has proven particularly challenging, as the plants depicted often combine realistic elements with exaggerated or impossible features, suggesting either symbolic representation, stylization, or reference to species no longer recognized. Some historians argue that medieval illustrators frequently altered plant forms for emphasis or mnemonic purposes, meaning the illustrations may not be intended as literal representations of real botanical specimens. Astronomical sections of the manuscript have been compared to medieval star charts and zodiac calendars, revealing partial similarities that suggest familiarity with contemporary cosmological concepts without confirming direct alignment to known systems. Zodiac imagery within the manuscript includes familiar symbols, yet their arrangement and accompanying text deviate from established astrological manuscripts, complicating efforts to map symbols directly to recognized traditions. The presence of new human figures interacting with complex fluid systems has generated speculation ranging from medical theories involving bodily humors to symbolic representations of transformation, purification, or cosmological flow. No known medical manuscript in the 15th century depicts human anatomy or physiology in a manner closely matching the voyage illustrations, leaving this section particularly resistant to classification. Linguistic analysis has shown that the manuscript's word patterns display positional rules, with certain symbols appearing only at the beginnings or ends of words, a behavior commonly associated with structured writing systems. These positional constraints suggest deliberate construction rather than randomness, reinforcing the argument that the text encodes information according to rules that remain unidentified. Attempts to map the text onto known languages through substitution have repeatedly failed, as no consistent phonetic values produce meaningful or stable translations across multiple sections. Some researchers have suggested that the manuscript may use an enciphered shorthand system, compressing information in a way that obscures both pronunciation and semantics. However, no surviving shorthand system from the medieval period fully accounts for the manuscript's complexity, consistency, and scale. The possibility that the manuscript encodes multiple languages or layers of meaning has also been explored, though such theories increase complexity without offering verifiable explanatory power. During the Cold War era, interest in the manuscript intensified as government cryptographers applied techniques developed for intelligence work, yet these efforts similarly failed to reveal decipherable content. The failure of expert codebreakers strengthened the manuscript's reputation as uniquely resistant, distinguishing it from historical ciphers that eventually yielded under sustained analytical pressure. Modern computational linguistics has confirmed that the manuscript exhibits entropy levels consistent with natural language. Yet this finding does not reveal semantic meaning or linguistic lineage. This contradiction, measurable structure without intelligible content, remains one of the most challenging aspects of the Voynich manuscript for contemporary researchers. Some scholars propose that the manuscript may represent a form of pseudo-language, constructed to imitate linguistic structure without conveying conventional meaning. Critics of this idea argue that maintaining such complexity across hundreds of pages would require extraordinary discipline and offers little incentive for the creator. Others suggest the manuscript functioned as a private reference work, meaningful only to its author or a limited circle of readers sharing contextual knowledge now lost. The absence of marginal notes, corrections, or revisions further complicates interpretation, as the manuscript appears unusually clean and consistent for a working document. This consistency suggests the text was copied carefully from an earlier source or composed according to a fixed system rather than developed experimentally. Provenance records indicate the manuscript passed through the hands of collectors and scholars who valued it despite being unable to read it. Its preservation suggests that mystery itself may have contributed to its perceived importance rather than diminishing its worth. The manuscript's survival contrasts with countless readable texts lost to time, highlighting how uncertainty can enhance historical significance. Each generation has approached the Voynich manuscript with new tools and assumptions, yet none have succeeded in establishing definitive meaning. At this point, the manuscript stands as an unresolved convergence of language, symbolism, and intention that continues to resist explanation despite sustained analytical effort. As analytical methods grew more advanced, researchers increasingly questioned whether the Voynich manuscript was ever intended to be decoded by anyone beyond its creator, raising the possibility that meaning may depend on lost conventions, private symbolism, or contextual knowledge that cannot be reconstructed through textual analysis alone. This perspective reframes the manuscript not as a puzzle awaiting solution, but as a historical artifact reflecting the intellectual environment of its time, where secrecy, exclusivity, and symbolic communication were often valued over accessibility or broad comprehension. In medieval Europe, knowledge related to medicine, alchemy, and cosmology was frequently restricted to small circles, sometimes encoded deliberately to protect ideas from misuse, misunderstanding, or external authority. If the Voynich manuscript emerged from such a context, its opacity may represent intentional design rather than failure, explaining why conventional decryption methods repeatedly fall short. Some historians suggest the manuscript could have functioned as a personal notebook, where symbols replaced words to accelerate writing speed or conceal meaning from unintended readers. Others propose that the manuscript represents an experimental system, a linguistic or symbolic project that was never completed, standardized, or disseminated beyond its originator. This interpretation could explain the manuscript's internal consistency without requiring it to convey coherent semantic meaning in the way modern readers expect. The absence of any known reference to the manuscript in contemporary records further supports the idea that it existed outside mainstream scholarly communication of its time. Unlike famous medieval works that were copied and circulated, the Voynich manuscript appears isolated, suggesting limited distribution or deliberate concealment. Its rediscovery centuries later transformed it from an obscure object into a subject of intense scrutiny, projecting modern expectations onto a document created under very different assumptions. This temporal distance complicates interpretation, as modern analytical frameworks may not align with the cognitive or cultural structures that shaped the manuscript's creation. Attempts to impose modern linguistic categories onto the text may therefore misinterpret its function, treating symbolic systems as failed languages rather than alternative forms of representation. The manuscript challenges the assumption that all structured writing must correspond to spoken language, highlighting the possibility of non-phonetic systems of meaning. In this sense, the Voynich manuscript occupies a conceptual space between text, diagram, and symbolic code, resisting classification within any single category. Its illustrations may not merely accompany the text, but function as integral components of meaning, suggesting a multimodal system that cannot be decoded through textual analysis alone. This possibility complicates efforts to separate image from script, as meaning may emerge only through their combined interpretation. Yet without surviving explanatory material, such integration remains speculative, leaving researchers to infer intent without confirmation. The manuscript's endurance reflects not only its physical preservation, but its ability to provoke inquiry across disciplines, each approaching the mystery with different assumptions and tools. Linguists, cryptographers, historians, artists, and computer scientists have all engaged with the manuscript, expanding understanding without achieving resolution. This interdisciplinary attention has enriched analysis while simultaneously multiplying interpretations, none capable of displacing the others conclusively. Over time, the Voynich manuscript has come to symbolize the limits of decipherment, illustrating how complexity and ambiguity can persist despite sustained intellectual effort. It stands as a reminder that not all artifacts yield their meaning through analysis alone, particularly when context has been erased by time. The manuscript forces a confrontation with uncertainty, challenging confidence in the ability of technology and method to resolve every historical question. In an era defined by data and accessibility, the existence of an unreadable book remains deeply unsettling. Its silence resists explanation, interpretation, and closure, sustaining fascination precisely because it denies resolution. Whether the manuscript encodes lost knowledge, deliberate secrecy, or structured meaning without semantic intent remains unresolved. Each explanation reflects more about contemporary expectations than about the manuscript itself. The enduring mystery lies not only in what the manuscript contains, but in why understanding remains perpetually out of reach. The Voynich manuscript persists as evidence that some questions survive, precisely because answers are unattainable. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you. The Bermuda Triangle is one of the most enduring mysteries of the modern era, known for reports of ships and aircraft disappearing under unclear circumstances across a heavily traveled region of the western North Atlantic Ocean, raising questions that persist despite decades of investigation and debate. The area is commonly described as forming a triangle between Miami and Florida, Bermuda in the North Atlantic, and San Juan in Puerto Rico, although its exact boundaries are not officially defined or recognized by maritime or aviation authorities. Despite the lack of formal geographic recognition, the region gained notoriety due to stories suggesting vessels vanished suddenly without distress signals, survivors, or recoverable wreckage, creating the perception of an environment that behaves differently from other oceanic regions. Early maritime history contains numerous shipwrecks and accidents throughout the Atlantic, but these events were not originally viewed as mysterious until writers and journalists began grouping unrelated incidents into a single narrative focused on the Bermuda Triangle. Public fascination increased significantly during the 20th century, when books and media presentations framed the region as a zone of unexplained disappearance, often emphasizing uncertainty while minimizing conventional explanations such as weather, navigation error, or mechanical failure. One of the most frequently cited cases is Flight 19, a group of U.S. Navy training aircraft that disappeared in December 1945 during a routine navigation exercise, an incident that later became central to the legend surrounding the Bermuda Triangle. Radio communications from Flight 19 revealed confusion among pilots regarding compass readings and their perceived location, leading to speculation that navigational instruments may have malfunctioned or that pilots became disoriented during the flight. Despite an extensive air and sea search operation covering thousands of square miles, no confirmed wreckage from Flight 19 was conclusively identified, reinforcing the belief that the region itself may conceal evidence more effectively than expected. Adding to the mystery, a rescue aircraft dispatched during the search reportedly disappeared as well, intensifying suspicion and contributing to the perception that multiple losses occurring close together could not be explained by coincidence alone. Over time, additional cases were retroactively linked to the Bermuda Triangle, including merchant ships, cargo vessels, and aircraft that failed to arrive at their destinations, often based on incomplete or inconsistent historical records. Media portrayals frequently emphasize dramatic details, while omitting contextual factors such as weather advisories, maintenance histories, or navigational limitations, reinforcing the impression that conventional explanations were inadequate or deliberately ignored. Natural explanations frequently proposed include sudden storms, rogue waves, and rapidly changing weather systems, all of which are well-documented phenomena capable of overwhelming even large vessels without leaving extensive debris. The Atlantic Ocean is known for violent and unpredictable weather, particularly in regions where warm and cold air masses collide, creating storms that can form quickly and dissipate before leaving detailed meteorological records. A Gulf Stream, a powerful ocean current flowing through the region, plays a significant role in dispersing wreckage, often carrying debris far from its original location and complicating recovery efforts. Objects entering the ocean within this current can be transported dozens of miles in a short period of time, creating the impression that ships or aircraft vanished completely rather than breaking apart or sinking. Aviation accidents over open water present similar challenges, as debris fields may be scattered widely, and aircraft operating before modern tracking systems often lacked precise location data at the time of loss. Before the widespread use of GPS and satellite tracking, aircraft could disappear without transmitting accurate positional information, making search operations heavily dependent on estimates rather than confirmed coordinates. Flight data recorders were not universally installed or recoverable in earlier decades, leaving investigators without critical information needed to reconstruct final moments in many historical aviation accidents. Claims of magnetic anomalies became popular explanations for navigational confusion, suggesting that compasses behaved unpredictably within the Bermuda Triangle and caused crews to lose orientation. Scientific studies, however, have not identified magnetic behavior in the region that differs significantly from normal global variation, undermining claims of unique magnetic disturbance. Experts note that confusion between magnetic north and true north historically caused navigational errors worldwide, particularly among crews unfamiliar with correcting for magnetic declination. Another proposed explanation involves methane hydrate releases from the ocean floor, which could theoretically reduce water density and cause ships to sink rapidly without warning. While methane releases are scientifically plausible, direct evidence linking such events to specific Bermuda Triangle incidents remains inconclusive due to the absence of corroborating physical data. Atmospheric phenomena such as microbursts, sudden downdrafts, and fast-forming storms have also been suggested as hazards capable of overwhelming aircraft before pilots could issue distress signals. These atmospheric effects were poorly understood and difficult to detect during earlier aviation eras, increasing uncertainty in cases lacking complete meteorological records. Critics of the Bermuda Triangle narrative argue that many incidents were misreported, exaggerated, or incorrectly located, with some accidents attributed to the region despite occurring far outside its commonly cited boundaries. Detailed investigations have shown that several ships believed to have vanished mysteriously were later confirmed to have sunk during documented storms or due to mechanical failure. Statistical analyses comparing accident rates inside and outside the Bermuda Triangle generally show no significant increase in risk within the region compared to other heavily traveled ocean areas. Insurance companies and maritime authorities do not classify the Bermuda Triangle as an area of exceptional danger, nor do they impose special warnings or restrictions for transit. These facts challenge the notion that the region represents a uniquely hazardous environment, suggesting that its reputation may be driven more by narrative than by measurable risk. Despite this, unresolved cases continue to attract attention, particularly those involving experienced crews, favorable weather reports, and the absence of distress signals or recoverable evidence. Human psychology plays a central role in the endurance of the mystery, as people are naturally drawn to patterns that impose meaning on uncertainty and unexplained loss. Once a region becomes associated with mystery, confirmation bias reinforces belief, causing new incidents to be interpreted through an established narrative lens. Cultural repetition strengthens perceived patterns, even when statistical evidence does not support claims of increased danger or anomaly. Over decades, the Bermuda Triangle has become a cultural symbol of the unknown, appearing in books, films, and documentaries that prioritize intrigue over methodological rigor. Fictional portrayals further blur the line between documented events and speculative interpretation, complicating efforts to separate fact from narrative embellishment. Advances in navigation, communication, and weather forecasting have significantly reduced unexplained losses in the region during recent decades. Satellite tracking, GPS systems, and automated distress signals now provide precise data that allows incidents to be reconstructed more accurately than in the past. The decline in mysterious disappearances raises questions about whether earlier cases were the result of environmental anomaly or technological limitation. Many past incidents may reflect observational gaps rather than extraordinary forces, with missing data preventing definitive conclusions rather than confirming unknown phenomena. Historical cases often lack sufficient documentation for complete reconstruction, leaving uncertainty that cannot be resolved through modern analysis alone. Absence of evidence does not necessarily imply extraordinary cause, but rather highlights the limitations of record-keeping and detection in earlier eras. Ocean environments are particularly effective at concealing outcomes, as depth, currents, and biological processes can erase physical traces rapidly. This reality challenges expectations of certainty and closure in maritime and aviation investigations. The Bermuda Triangle illustrates the limits of investigation when evidence is incomplete and environments are hostile to recovery. Scholars caution against attributing unknown outcomes to unknown forces, emphasizing that complexity and uncertainty do not require extraordinary explanation. Sensational narratives can obscure practical lessons related to safety, training, and risk management by shifting focus away from probable causes. Balanced assessment requires separating documented facts from assumptions reinforced through repetition and selective storytelling. This process is complicated by decades of media framing that favors mystery over nuance. The persistence of the Bermuda Triangle reflects the power of narrative to outlast evidence. The mystery continues because no single explanation satisfies all observers or addresses every unresolved detail. Each theory accounts for certain elements while leaving others unanswered, preventing consensus from forming. The lack of closure sustains public fascination, transforming uncertainty into a defining feature rather than a temporary condition. The Bermuda Triangle challenges assumptions about predictability and control in complex environments. It highlights how human limitation interacts with natural forces to produce outcomes that resist easy explanation. The region may represent narrative convergence rather than physical anomaly, where stories accumulate faster than evidence. Uncertainty itself becomes the central element of the mystery. Over time, the story grows larger than the individual incidents that originally inspired it. Cultural memory preserves ambiguity even as factual clarity improves. Evidence alone does not always resolve perception. The Bermuda Triangle remains a topic of debate rather than conclusion. Modern analysis favors conventional explanations supported by probability and environmental science. Extraordinary claims lack consistent empirical support. Yet unresolved cases resist definitive dismissal due to missing data. This tension ensures the mystery's longevity. Each generation revisits the same questions through new technological and cultural perspectives. Interpretation evolves while the available evidence remains largely unchanged. The mystery survives through storytelling rather than confirmation. It reflects how humans respond to uncertainty, loss, and incomplete knowledge. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you.
On November 24, 1971, a man identifying himself as Don Cooper boarded Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305, a routine domestic flight scheduled to travel from Portland to Seattle, unaware to most passengers that this short journey would become one of the most enduring and debated mysteries in modern aviation history. The flight was expected to last less than 30 minutes, a common route flown daily without incident. making it an unlikely setting for a crime that would challenge investigators, aviation experts, and federal authorities for decades without delivering a single definitive answer. Cooper appeared calm and ordinary, wearing a dark business suit, white shirt, black tie, and sunglasses, blending effortlessly among other passengers, showing no visible signs of stress, urgency, or emotional instability that might attract attention from the crew or fellow travelers. He ordered a bourbon and soda shortly after boarding, paid in cash, and sat quietly in his seat, displaying deliberate and controlled movements that would later be interpreted as signs of confidence, preparation, and an unusual level of composure for someone about to commit a major federal crime. Nothing about Cooper's behavior suggested impulsiveness or desperation, and witnesses later described him as polite, reserved, and unremarkable, reinforcing the idea that his strength lay not in intimidation, but in remaining unnoticed until the moment he chose to act. Shortly after the aircraft took off, Cooper handed a handwritten note to a nearby flight attendant, who initially assumed it contained a phone number or casual message, an assumption that delayed the realization that the flight was already under threat. Cooper calmly leaned toward the attendant and quietly instructed her to read the note, explaining in a low and steady voice that he was carrying a bomb, transforming an ordinary flight into a hostage situation without causing panic among the passengers. When the attendant read the note, she realized the message was direct, unemotional, and precise, outlining Cooper's demands without exaggeration or theatrics, suggesting careful planning rather than an emotionally driven or impulsive act. To reinforce the seriousness of the threat, Cooper partially opened his briefcase, revealing what appeared to be wires, batteries, and cylindrical objects, convincing the crew that the device could be real, even though it was never conclusively identified. Cooper demanded $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes, specifying details about the currency and delivery, demonstrating foresight and understanding of negotiation, while maintaining a calm demeanor that reduced the likelihood of resistance. The flight attendant immediately informed the cockpit, and the captain contacted air traffic control, initiating a coordinated response involving airline officials, local authorities, and federal agencies tasked with managing the situation without escalating risk to passengers. Authorities chose to comply with Cooper's demands, prioritizing passenger safety above all else, a decision that would later be questioned by critics who argued that cooperation enabled Cooper's successful escape and disappearance. The aircraft landed in Seattle as instructed, where law enforcement discreetly delivered the ransom money and parachutes, while passengers were allowed to disembark calmly, largely unaware of the full scope of the hijacking they had just experienced. Cooper allowed every passenger to leave the aircraft unharmed, an action that further distinguished the case from typical hijackings, as no physical violence occurred and no injuries were reported during the entire incident. With only the flight crew remaining on board, Cooper instructed the pilots to prepare for another departure, directing them to fly toward Mexico City under specific conditions that he personally dictated with unusual precision. Cooper requested a low cruising altitude, reduced speed, and specific flap settings, instructions that immediately raised questions about his familiarity with aviation procedures and whether he possessed military, technical, or flight-related training. The Boeing 727 departed Seattle again, heading south into increasingly severe weather conditions as darkness fell and heavy clouds, rain, and strong winds surrounded the aircraft during its night flight. Throughout this phase of the journey, Cooper remained calm and composed, showing no hesitation or second thoughts. Behavior that investigators later debated as either evidence of experience or carefully controlled confidence, masking uncertainty at a point believed to be over the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. Cooper instructed the crew to remain inside the cockpit and avoid interference, asserting full control over the situation without raising his voice or resorting to threats. Cooper then opened the rear staircase of the Boeing 727, a unique feature of that aircraft model at the time, allowing exit while the plane was still airborne, an action that would define the mystery that followed. At approximately 10,000 feet above the ground, in darkness, rain, and turbulent conditions, Cooper jumped from the aircraft, carrying the ransom money and vanishing instantly into the night without being seen by any witnesses. No one observed the exact moment of the jump, and the precise location where Cooper exited the aircraft was never conclusively determined, creating immediate uncertainty that would complicate search efforts and reconstruction attempts. When the plane landed safely, it became clear that Cooper was gone, leaving behind no direct physical evidence that could confirm whether he survived the jump or died shortly afterward. The FBI launched an extensive investigation, codenamed mobilizing hundreds of agents and resources across multiple states in what would become one of the largest and longest-running manhunts in American history. Search teams combed forests, rivers, mountains, and remote terrain, while aircraft conducted aerial surveys, all in an effort to locate Cooper, the parachute, or any trace of the ransom money that might confirm his fate. Despite the scale and intensity of the search, no body was found, no parachute recovered, and no clothing conclusively linked to Cooper was ever identified within the search areas. Investigators carefully recorded the serial numbers of every ransom bill and distributed them nationwide, instructing banks, businesses, and financial institutions to report any appearance of the money. For years, none of the ransom money appeared in circulation, deepening the mystery and raising questions about whether Cooper survived long enough to spend the money at all. Experts debated the likelihood of survival, noting that Cooper wore a business suit and loafers rather than specialized parachuting or survival gear suitable for rugged terrain and severe weather. The jump occurred during strong wind, heavy rain, and poor visibility, environmental factors that significantly increased the risk of injury, disorientation, or death upon landing. Some aviation experts argued that Cooper's calm behavior and detailed instructions suggested prior experience, while others believed the jump was reckless and likely fatal despite any planning. The absence of physical evidence left investigators unable to determine whether Cooper had planned an escape route or simply accepted the risk of an uncertain outcome. For nearly a decade, the case produced no significant breakthroughs, gradually fading from public attention while remaining unresolved within federal investigative files. In 1980, the mystery resurfaced when a young boy discovered deteriorating bundles of cash along the banks of the Columbia River during a family outing. Examination confirmed that the serial numbers on the bills matched those from Cooper's ransom, proving that at least part of the money had reached the ground after the jump. This discovery reignited national interest, but raised new questions. As the location did not clearly align with estimated flight paths or the predicted jump zone calculated by investigators, the rest of the ransom money was never recovered, and the parachute Cooper used was never found, leaving the circumstances of his landing unresolved. The discovery neither confirmed Cooper's survival nor definitively proved his death, instead adding another layer of ambiguity to an already complex investigation. Over the years, authorities investigated dozens of suspects, many with military, aviation, or technical backgrounds that might explain Cooper's apparent knowledge and composure. Some suspects experienced sudden lifestyle changes after 1971, fueling speculation, but none could be conclusively linked to the hijacking through physical or forensic evidence. Fingerprint evidence collected from the aircraft proved inconclusive, and witness descriptions varied widely. limiting their usefulness in identifying Cooper with certainty. Later, DNA testing conducted on materials recovered from the plane failed to produce a definitive match, reinforcing the absence of concrete leads. Cooper's true identity remained unknown, and the case became defined not only by what was discovered, but by what was missing. Unlike many crimes, no verified confession has ever surfaced, and no individual has been conclusively proven to be D.B. Cooper. The hijacking involved no physical violence against passengers, contributing to its unusual place in criminal history and complicating psychological analysis of Cooper's motives. Cooper did not seek publicity or recognition, disappearing quietly rather than attempting to exploit the notoriety of his actions. This absence of attention-seeking behavior has made it difficult for investigators to understand whether financial gain was his only objective. The simplicity of the crime, combined with its unresolved outcome, continues to disturb researchers, investigators, and aviation experts alike. Each theory proposed over the years explains certain aspects of the case while failing to account for others, preventing any single explanation from gaining universal acceptance. By this point in the investigation, the D.B. Cooper case had transformed from a criminal inquiry into a lasting mystery defined by unanswered questions rather than definitive conclusions. As years passed, the absence of definitive evidence reshaped the investigation, shifting focus from active pursuit to analysis of probabilities, environmental factors, and human behavior, while the lack of closure allowed speculation to grow alongside renewed public curiosity and independent research efforts. Investigators revisited flight data, weather reports, and wind patterns, attempting to reconstruct Cooper's possible landing zones, yet variations in estimates produced wide search areas, complicating efforts to narrow conclusions with confidence or precision. Advances in aviation modeling enabled simulations of the aircraft's path and descent conditions, but these models depended on assumptions that could not be verified due to missing variables, including Cooper's exact jump timing and body orientation. The terrain below the estimated jump area consisted of dense forests, rivers, and uneven ground, where evidence could easily be concealed, destroyed by nature, or remain undiscovered for decades without deliberate excavation. Environmental factors such as rainfall, erosion, vegetation growth, and seasonal flooding further reduced the likelihood that physical evidence would survive intact long enough to be found by search teams. Some analysts propose that Cooper may have intentionally chosen a remote area to avoid detection, accepting environmental risks in exchange for anonymity and reduced chances of immediate pursuit by authorities. Others argued that Cooper may have miscalculated conditions, overestimating his ability to control descent and underestimating the dangers posed by weather and terrain during a nighttime jump. The question of Cooper's parachuting skill became central. As experts debated whether his equipment choices suggested experience or revealed critical misunderstandings about survival and landing requirements. Cooper selected a civilian parachute rather than a military-grade model, a choice that some interpret as evidence of inexperience, while others suggest it was sufficient for his intended escape plan. The absence of a reserve parachute raised additional doubts, prompting speculation about whether Cooper truly intended to survive or simply accepted an unpredictable outcome. Psychological profiling attempted to infer Cooper's motivations, analyzing his restraint, lack of violence, and methodical behavior as indicators of a personality driven by control rather than aggression or notoriety. The lack of communication after the crime suggested Cooper did not seek recognition, a trait uncommon among high-profile criminals and one that limited opportunities for investigators to identify him through later behavior. Some researchers suggested Cooper may have died shortly after landing, leaving no opportunity to spend the money or leave detectable traces within populated areas. Others proposed that he survived, recovered the money, and lived quietly, avoiding attention and successfully blending into society without drawing suspicion. The partial discovery of ransom money along the Columbia River complicated both theories, as it neither confirmed survival nor conclusively demonstrated a fatal outcome. Analysts debated whether the money reached the river naturally through erosion or flooding, or whether it had been intentionally buried or lost during Cooper's escape. The possibility that Cooper discarded some money deliberately to reduce weight or mislead investigators remains unproven but frequently discussed. Without corroborating evidence, each interpretation remains speculative, supported by probabilities rather than confirmation. The case illustrates how incomplete evidence forces investigators to rely on inference rather than direct proof. As time passed, the likelihood of discovering new physical evidence diminished steadily. In 2016, the FBI formally announced the suspension of active investigation, acknowledging that available leads had been exhausted and that further inquiry was unlikely to yield resolution. The Bureau emphasized that resources would be redirected toward cases with greater potential for actionable outcomes, effectively closing the chapter on official pursuit. Despite this decision, public interest remained strong, sustained by documentaries, books, and online communities dedicated to re-examining the case. Independent researchers continue to analyze data, propose suspects, and revisit old evidence with modern tools and perspectives. The persistence of these efforts reflects the enduring appeal of unresolved mysteries grounded in documented events. The D.B. Cooper case occupies a rare position where facts are well established, yet conclusions remain elusive. This balance between certainty and uncertainty continues to challenge assumptions about investigation, planning, and consequence. Few cases demonstrate so clearly how preparation does not guarantee control over outcomes. Fewer still show how a single moment can generate decades of unanswered questions. The mystery endures because it resists closure without resorting to speculation. At its core, the case raises fundamental questions about risk, calculation, and chance. Did Cooper anticipate every variable, or did unforeseen conditions determine his fate? Was the jump a calculated escape, or a final gamble taken under pressure? Did Cooper survive long enough to disappear intentionally, or did the environment claim him silently? Each possibility remains plausible. Due to the absence of decisive evidence, the investigation documented what occurred aboard the aircraft with remarkable clarity. What happened after Cooper left the plane remains unknown. The boundary between fact and interpretation defines the case's lasting ambiguity. Over time, the mystery has shifted from a question of identity to a question of outcome. The answer may never be conclusively established. The D.B. Cooper hijacking is not defined by what investigators found, but by what they could not confirm. The records remain accessible, the evidence preserved, yet the truth remains incomplete. Time has transformed the case from active investigation into historical inquiry. Each new analysis adds perspective rather than resolution. The absence of closure continues to invite debate rather than consensus. The mystery persists because it withstands explanation without contradiction. Cooper's fate remains suspended between survival and death. The case stands as a reminder that some questions resist definitive answers. Interpretation fills the space where certainty ends. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you.
In February 1959, deep within the frozen Ural Mountains, an event occurred that would become one of the most enduring mysteries of modern history. It involved a group of experienced hikers, official investigations, and a series of unexplained findings that still resist a single, definitive explanation. The case would later be known as the Dyatlov Pass incident, named after the leader of the expedition, Igor Dyatlov. More than 6 decades later, the incident continues to raise questions among researchers, scientists, and historians around the world. At the time, the Soviet Union was a tightly controlled state where information was carefully managed. Incidents that could challenge official narratives were often minimized, simplified, or quietly archived. The expedition consisted of 9 young men and women, all students or recent graduates, most of them studying engineering or technical fields. They were not amateurs, but trained hikers with prior experience in extreme winter conditions. Their goal was to reach Mount O'Torton, a challenging but achievable destination for a group of their skill level. The route was classified as a high-difficulty expedition, but not considered unusually dangerous. Igor Dyatlov, only 23 years old, was known as a disciplined and competent leader. He had planned the journey carefully, selecting participants who met strict physical and technical requirements. The group departed in late January 1959. Early stages of the expedition proceeded normally, with regular progress and no signs of distress or conflict. Diaries recovered later revealed a relaxed and optimistic mood. The hikers joked, took photographs, and documented their journey in detail. These records are significant because they show no evidence of fear, panic, or internal disagreement prior to the incident. Everything appeared routine. On February 1st, the group set up camp on the slope of a mountain known locally as Kholat Syakhl in the indigenous Mansi language. The name translates roughly to Mountain of the Dead. Despite its ominous name, the mountain was not considered unusually dangerous. The name was part of local tradition and did not indicate recent incidents. Weather conditions that night were severe, with strong winds and temperatures estimated to be below -30 degrees Celsius. Still, the group had adequate equipment to survive the night. At some point during the night, something happened that caused all 9 hikers to leave their tent abruptly. This decision alone is one of the most puzzling elements of the case. Leaving a tent in such conditions without proper clothing would almost certainly be fatal. When search teams later found the campsite, they discovered the tent partially buried in snow but still standing. The most striking detail was that the tent had been cut open from the inside. This suggested the hikers did not exit through the normal entrance. Footprints leading away from the tent were visible in the snow. The key appeared orderly, not chaotic, and belonged only to the members of the group. There were no signs of a struggle at the campsite, and no evidence of other people being present. The footprints led downhill toward a wooded area approximately 1.5 kilometers away. The first bodies were found beneath a large tree at the edge of the forest. 2 hikers were barefoot and wearing minimal clothing. Nearby, investigators found the remains of a small fire, indicating an attempt to survive and stay warm. The cause of death for these 2 individuals was determined to be hypothermia. Between the tree and the original campsite, 3 more bodies were discovered. Their positions suggested they were attempting to return to the tent. These individuals were more clothed than the first 2, but still inadequately protected for the conditions. Like the others, they showed no signs of external violence and were believed to have died from exposure. Months later, after snow had melted, the remaining 4 bodies were found in a ravine deeper within the forest. These hikers had suffered severe internal injuries, including fractured ribs and skull damage. What made these injuries unusual was the lack of corresponding external trauma. There were no major cuts or wounds that would normally accompany such force. Medical examiners compared the injuries to those typically seen in high-impact car accidents. One of the bodies was missing its tongue, while others were missing eyes or soft tissue. Official reports attributed this to natural decomposition and scavenging animals. However, some researchers have questioned whether this explanation fully accounts for the observed conditions. The official Soviet investigation concluded that the hikers died due to what was described as a compelling natural force. This vague wording offered no clear cause and left many questions unanswered. The case was closed, and for many years, access to documents related to the incident was limited. As records became more accessible decades later, renewed interest brought fresh analysis and alternative theories. One of the most widely discussed explanations is an avalanche. According to this theory, the hikers may have feared an imminent snowslide. In this scenario, they cut their way out of the tent to escape quickly, intending to return once the danger passed. Critics of the avalanche theory note the absence of clear avalanche debris and question whether conditions were sufficient to trigger one. Another theory involves katabatic winds, sudden, powerful gusts that can create intense noise and pressure. Such winds could potentially cause panic or disorientation, prompting the group to flee the tent. Related to this is the infrasonic wind theory, which suggests certain wind patterns can induce anxiety, nausea, and irrational fear. Some researchers believe these physiological effects could explain the hikers' sudden and seemingly illogical behavior. A more controversial theory involves military testing. At the time, the Soviet Union was conducting classified weapons experiments in remote regions. Reports of unexplained lights in the sky on the night of the incident have fueled speculation about missile or parachute mine tests. Supporters of this theory argue that a military explosion could explain both the panic and the internal injuries. Others point out that no official evidence confirms such tests occurred in the immediate area that night. There is also the hypothesis of human error combined with extreme weather, suggesting a chain of small decisions led to disaster. Under this view, exhaustion, cold, and poor visibility may have contributed to a fatal series of choices. Some have proposed that conflict with local indigenous people could be responsible, but investigations found no evidence supporting this claim. Footprints, injuries, and the lack of defensive wounds strongly argue against an attack by other humans. Radiation traces found on some clothing items added another layer of mystery, though levels were not considered immediately lethal. The source of this radiation remains debated, with explanations ranging from occupational exposure to environmental contamination. In recent years, Russian authorities reopened the case, focusing primarily on natural explanations. A 2020 review concluded that a delayed slab avalanche was the most likely cause, though not all researchers agree. Critics argue that this conclusion still fails to account for every detail, particularly the pattern of injuries and behavior. What makes the Diatlov Pass incident unique is not one inexplicable detail, but the accumulation of anomalies. Each theory provides partial answers, yet none fully explains all known facts. This gap between evidence and explanation is what continues to drive interest in the case. Modern technology has allowed for simulations, terrain analysis, and forensic reassessments. Even so, uncertainty remains, and interpretations often depend on which details are prioritized. Some believe the truth lies in a combination of natural forces rather than a single dramatic cause. Others suspect that key information may have been withheld or lost during the original investigation. More than 60 years later, the Diatlov Pass incident remains officially unresolved in the public mind. The hikers' final decisions, their fear, and the precise sequence of events remain unknown. What is certain is that 9 lives were lost under extraordinary circumstances. The documents, photographs, and physical evidence all exist, yet they do not converge on one clear answer. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the case is how ordinary it began. A routine expedition, carefully planned, undertaken by capable individuals, ended in tragedy. Whether caused by nature, human error, or something else entirely, the outcome was irreversible. The mountain has kept its secret, buried beneath snow, time, and speculation. And so, the question remains open, inviting analysis, debate, and reflection. What do you think really happened at Diatlov Pass? The facts are real. The explanation is up to you.